A complaint about loud music. That's it. That's all it took to put an entire city on lockdown, with armed police patrolling the streets. But this wasn't just about noise. What we're going to see is how, in the Indian state of Odisha, a seemingly small spark can ignite a fire that's been smoldering for decades.
So this was the scene in the city of Cuttack in October 2025. You've got armed police, a city completely on edge after days of unrest and arson. You'd think the cause for something like this would have to be absolutely massive, right? Well, you might be surprised.
That's right. It all kicked off with a complaint about loud music during a religious procession. You know, it's a crazy reminder that sometimes the smallest, most trivial arguments can have the most explosive consequences.
So, that's the big question here. How on earth does a local dispute over music spiral into citywide violence, curfews, and even an internet blackout? Well, it turns out the answer isn't really about the music at all. It's about a history of tension that goes back a long, long way.
Okay, so first things first. Let's get a clearer picture of what actually went down in Cuttack. And things escalated incredibly fast. It all starts with a clash over music on the morning of October 4th. By the very next day, a motorcycle rally, which was backed by the VHP, a prominent Hindu nationalist group, leads to even more clashes, this time with the police. And by that evening, the city is under a strict curfew and the internet is completely shut down. All of that in less than 48 hours? And the aftermath? It was severe. We're talking more than 24 people injured, property destroyed, a massive security deployment. And then the VHP called for a citywide shutdown, or a Bandh, which pretty much guaranteed that the tension wasn't going to die down anytime soon.
But here's the real kicker. As shocking as all this was in Cuttack, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. To really truly understand it, we have to wind the clock back 17 years to a much larger and much deadlier conflict that shook the entire state to its core.
We're talking about the Kandhamal riots of 2008, one of the absolute worst instances of communal violence in Odisha's history. And honestly, the numbers alone tell a harrowing story.
Over 60,000 people. Just think about that for a second. That's the population of a small city, all driven from their homes, forced to flee into forests, or crammed into relief camps.
And on top of that, over 5,600 homes were either looted or just burned to the ground. Entire villages were literally wiped off the map.
And nearly 400 churches were destroyed or vandalized. This wasn't some random chaotic violence. This was targeted destruction on a truly staggering scale.
And then we come to the death toll, which is where things get really grim and deeply contested. Officially, the government said 39 people died. But independent groups on the ground, they reported a number that was tragically, horrifyingly higher, possibly over 500.
So, we've got two major outbreaks of violence, 17 years apart. What lit the fuse each time? Well, when we compare the triggers, we start to see this fascinating pattern. The sparks might have been different, but the fuel was tragically the same.
So in 2008, the trigger was huge. The assassination of a very prominent VHP leader. Immediately, organizations that follow the Hindutva ideology, a form of Hindu nationalism, blamed Christians for it, even though Maoist insurgents later claimed they did it. Now, compare that to 2025, a local dispute over loud music. A political assassination versus a neighborhood argument. The scale just could not be more different.
And just listen to the language used back in 2008. Within hours of the assassination, before any real investigation could even begin, this was the public declaration from a VHP leader. It wasn't a call for justice or due process. It was a call for a befitting reply. And that is exactly what happened next.
So why? Why do such totally different sparks lead to the same kind of explosion? Well, it's because the violence isn't really about the spark. It's about the deep political and social fault lines that have existed in Odisha for decades.
Okay, so what is this fuel? There are really 4 key ingredients. First up, you've got ethnic tensions between the indigenous Kanda tribes and the Pana Dalits, and a lot of that is over access to affirmative action benefits, something called scheduled tribe status. Second, there's a long history of religious campaigns. For decades, groups connected to the Sangh Parivar, which is a family of Hindu nationalist organizations, have run these anti-conversion movements, creating friction with Christian communities. Third, there's political mobilization. Those same groups, like the VHP, were absolutely central to organizing the protests back in 2008. And finally, you have the shifting political landscape. See, in 2008, the state was run by a coalition that included the BJP.
Then in 2024, the BJP, a Hindu nationalist party, came to power all on its own, and some reports suggest communal tensions have been on the rise ever since.
So with all this going on, how has the state actually responded to these recurring crises? Well, the government's approach has been pretty complex, because they're dealing with both the communal violence and this other threat that played a really key role in that 2008 tragedy.
So you see this kind of two-sided response from the state. On the one hand, you have official government programs to give financial aid to civilian victims of communal violence, but on the other hand, you have all these press releases about major security operations against Maoist insurgents, a threat the government labels left-wing extremism, or LWE.
So what exactly is LWE? It's the official term for organized violence by these Maoist groups. And here is the crucial, tragic connection. It was a Maoist group that eventually took responsibility for that 2008 assassination. The very act that was used to justify this massive wave of anti-Christian violence was committed by someone else entirely. So when you lay out all the key events over the last 2 decades, a really clear and frankly disturbing pattern starts to emerge. I mean, just look at this timeline. You see violence flaring up in 2007, which then absolutely explodes after the assassination in 2008. Then, after a period of relative quiet, there's a huge political shift in 2024 when a new government takes power. And just 1 year later, boom, the cycle starts all over again in Cuttack. It's a clear pattern of tension, eruption, and political change.
And that right there is the heart of the issue. The specific triggers keep changing. It goes from a major political assassination to a fight over loud music. But these are just the sparks. The fire itself is being fed by the exact same deep, unresolved tensions that have been simmering just below the surface for years.
And this leaves us with a final and pretty urgent question. As the politics in Odisha continue to shift, with all these underlying issues still not resolved, is the state just destined to repeat this cycle over and over again? Or can this pattern of violence finally be broken? Well, that remains to be seen.